Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you all of my spoilery thoughts while reading Memories of Ice by Stephen Erickson. This is the third book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. I am going to be filming this vlog style, so I'm going to be doing check-ins hopefully at the end of part one, not just at the end of part one, at the end of each part. I'm currently at the end of part one, so I will also try and remember to leave timestamps in the description just in case you're currently reading this book and you want to follow along with my thoughts as you're also reading it. Then you can be assured that you're not going to be spoiled for stuff that happens later in the book. Obviously I am still going to be sharing my theories and things, but I wouldn't consider those spoilers because I don't know what's going to happen in this book. I'm going to put this book down because it is very heavy. I do have notes in front of me and I also have my Kindle where I've been highlighting stuff. I'm buddy reading this series with my partner who is a huge fan of Malazan. When he read this series the first time, he read it on his Kindle, and because we share a library, it means that I also have access to the ebooks, which is perfect because I have been highlighting so much already. That's the main reason why I want to do this vlog style, because if I were to wait until I'd finished the book, that would be a very long video to film in one go. So I'm going to do probably 4 or 5 check-ins as I move through the book. I will also have my Malazan playlist linked in the description, just in case you would like to check out my reviews for book 1 and book 2. But let's kick things off with my initial impressions and what I was expecting going into this book. So there was a reveal at the end of book 2 that Empress Lysine has this plan. Dujek has deliberately become a rebel because that means that he can ally with enemies of the Malazan Empire like Caladan Brood and Anamanda Rake. All of this is being done because there is this new threat called the Panian Dominion, and going into this book I wasn't sure, okay, first of all, what the Panian Dominion was. I also didn't know what the big deal was. Why do they need to be stopped? And having now read the first section, I really like how this has kind of laid the groundwork, and it's not just launched straight into things. It's not just launched straight into this fight. We're getting a lot of backstory, and I really liked the epilogue, not the epilogue, the prologue. This book has hooked me quicker than any other book in the series so far. Granted, I'm only 3 books in, but there was so much information given to us in that epilogue. So we start way back in the past and we're getting more of an insight into this never-ending war between the Jagguts and the Imas, who have since become the Tilan Imas. There's this situation where a group of Imas are pursuing this Jaggut woman and her 2 children. Then on the other side there's another bonecaster who helps this Jaggut and puts these 2 children into what they think is the Jaggut Warren. Turns out it's not. Turns out it's actually something to do with the Kachane Chamele. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing that right. Later on we circle back to this in Tok the Younger's perspective, where the last time we saw him in book 1 he was being pulled into the Chaos Warren. In this book he is now in this place where he can see that something has broken free. They're described as being a matron of the Kachane Chamele. In the past we saw that by sending these 2 Jaggut children into this warren, that has released this matron of the Kachane Chamele. It was said that it was going to take years and years for this to come about, and in the present day, in Tok the Younger's perspective, it seems like this has happened within the last few decades. Something else interesting that happened in the prologue was we saw 3 elder gods, Cruel, Draconus and Sister of Cold Nights, who arrive on this continent in order to take down Kala, who has been ruling this place and hasn't been a very nice ruler, let's just put it that way. It was really interesting to get more of an insight into Kala because he was someone that was mentioned in the first book as being Caladan Brood's second in command. We didn't know anything about him otherwise, and we now find out that he was cursed by these elder gods, but he also cursed them in return. I believe that we have already met Cruel and also Sister of Cold Nights. Draconus is revealed to be the person who created Dragon Purr, which is Anamanda Rake's weapon, and he also has been enslaved within this weapon that he created. Sister of Cold Nights, I believe, is also Night Chill. I don't think that I would have picked up on that myself, but my partner kind of mentioned it to me, and now it actually makes complete sense. I think at this point in the book, we are meant to have that in the back of our mind, but the characters themselves, they haven't necessarily made the connection, apart from Calla obviously knows that Night Chill is one of the people who has now been incorporated into Silver Fox, and that's why Calla does not want Silver Fox to continue living. We know that Silver Fox is a combination of Tattersail, Night Chill, and also her mate, whose name I can't remember at this point. But it explains why Calla has such a big issue with Silver Fox. The curse that they placed on Calla is that everything you achieve will turn to dust in your hands. Every time you rise, you will fall. What was really interesting about the end of that chapter is that we see Cruel pull this land into a warren, which I think it's actually confirmed later in the book, but this is basically what turns out to become the Imperial Warren, which we saw in the second book. And we saw, was it Fiddler or Callum? I think it was Fiddler came across the mark of Calla in this Imperial Warren, and so there's like those callbacks again to information that we'd been given, but we hadn't really understood it, or at least I hadn't understood it at that point. Then the final thing that happens in that prologue is we see this beast who is searching for his mate. There's a quote that I've highlighted saying, "Time would come to settle the score against Callor, who destroyed his home," and we have no other information about this beast. We know that he's clearly from this place, and he's also much older even than the Elder Gods. So we then see him again briefly in Tok the Younger's perspective when Tok is being pulled into the Chaos Warren. They both only have one eye, and that's all we literally know about this beast at this point. One of the new perspectives that we get is Gruntle, and his chapters, I'm not gonna lie, I've struggled with them. I think because it reminds me of when I read Gardens of the Moon for the first time, and I was just really having to concentrate to understand what was happening. I'm not finding I'm having that feeling now with some of the Bridgeburner characters or with characters that we've already met in previous books. So it's not that I'm not willing to put in the effort to understand what I'm being told, it's just that I find it so much easier to read the chapters that are told from the characters that we've already met and that I already know some about. All we know about Gruntle is that him and his colleagues are protecting this caravan that is travelling towards Caputstan, I think is how it's pronounced. They're travelling towards this city that we know is the next target of the Panian Dominion. Along the way, they also come across a group of Barghast. This group is then attacked by these undead Kachane Chameleys. Very interested to see how that develops. I'm assuming that Gruntle isn't dead. Like, it ends with a kind of fade out of consciousness, but I'm assuming he's not dead, even if maybe some of his companions are. There's also this whole thing that's happening with something called the Chained God, which I believe is a god that was somehow drawn down into this world. It's described as an alien creature, and it was chained, and now it's poisoning the earth. We've been told about Burn, who is the sleeping goddess, and a living warren. Caladan Brood is actually connected to her. He carries this hammer, or is it a hammer or a mallet? He carries some kind of weapon that was forged by her that has the power to cut the chains of this chained god. When it first mentioned this sleeping goddess called Burn, I realised at the start of most chapters it says the date and it describes it in terms of Burn's sleep, and so that was just like a little small detail that I really appreciated. But yeah, we very briefly get the perspective of someone called Manug, who is travelling to the crippled god. He gets stopped on the way by some of the bridge burners, but he ends up going into this tent where the crippled god is chained. He gives him a stack of wooden cards, which I think is possibly a deck of dragons. We've had so much information about the deck of dragons and how they're linked to the warrens and the houses, or the holds as they used to be called. Harren seems to be turning into an ascendant because of what happened in the first book. First of all, he took in some some of the blood of a hound. And he's also, to our knowledge, the only person who has travelled into Dragonpur and then been able to escape. One of my favourite parts so far was where Perrin was transported to the Azath house, and he came across Ralik, Nom and Vorkan, who we know vanished into the Azath house at the end of book 1. He also comes across Raced, the Jagged Tyrant, who is now the guardian of this house, and he takes him down several layers. He finds himself in this concourse where he is seeing what he thinks are cards of the deck of dragons, except that it's more than the deck of dragons because there's cards here that he didn't recognise. He ends up travelling into one of the cards, which is called the Hold of the Beasts, which long before the First Throne, this was the heart of the Tilan Imas power. And he's kind of reflecting on the Tilan Imas and how, because they're immortal, they have outlived their own gods. And it's this very poignant moment where he's actually appreciating what this race of people have been through. And I thought that was done really well. We know that Silver Fox is trying to bring together the Tilan Imas. We don't know why yet. I don't think that has actually been explained, but I have a theory because it keeps mentioning, obviously, like, we know the reason why the Tilan Imas are immortal is because of this ritual that they performed. I'm wondering whether this second gathering is actually to reverse that ritual or to attempt to reverse it. I don't know whether I'm getting confused about something, but Perrin, when he's in the Hold of the Beasts, he sees these two thrones and he's really confused about why there's two thrones in this hold. I got deja vu at that point. I am sure that that was mentioned in book 2 at some point, but I don't know whether I'm getting confused with another scene where Felison, Herbrick, can't pronounce his name, and Culp are in this city, this like underground city. I think there was a bunch of humans that were trying to turn themselves into Soul Taken, and the Imas intervened, and I'm sure at that point they also saw a throne. Can't remember whether it was two thrones though. I feel like I might have got that confused, but lots of interesting information being revealed about these houses and these holds, how potentially when you become an Ascendant or when you go into a House of Azath, you have a choice over which house you become a part of, but you can only become a part of a house where there are spaces. That's what happened to Kellen Vad and Dancer. They went into the Dead House, but because Hood is already in charge of the House of Death, that's why they ended up becoming Shadow Throne and Cotillion and taking control of that house. I really hope that what I've said has made sense, but the last thing I wanted to talk about is where we leave off. So we know that Perrin and some of the bridge burners accompanying, I can't remember his name, but one of the Barghast, they are going to see one of the Barghast clans to try and get them involved in this fight against the Panian Dominion. I can't remember if I've mentioned this already, but we also know that the Panian Dominion are some kind of religious cult, maybe. We know at some point that they invaded or they went to this other island where the Segules live. Again, I've probably pronounced that wrong, but we meet this other species in Tok the Younger's perspective. They're travelling with Lady Envy, and we know the Panian Dominion went to their people and tried to convert them, but they didn't want to know. And so that's why they've now come to Genebakis to try and fight against them and stop them. I feel like that's enough for this update, so I am going to wrap things up here. The great thing about doing this vlog style is if it turns out I forgot stuff, then I can always talk about it later in the vlog, but I will catch up with you hopefully once I'm at the end of part 2. Before we get into my thoughts on part 2 of Memories of Ice, I need to correct something that I kept saying wrong throughout the first part of this vlog. I kept saying Panian Dominion, and I know that's wrong. I know it's Panian Domin, but I saw it wrong the first time that I read that phrase, and I just can't unsee it now. So that's my mistake. Hopefully I will remember to say it the right way throughout the rest of this vlog, but I think it might actually be a good place to start actually by talking about the Panian Domin, because we got quite a lot of information in that last part, especially the last few chapters. From what I gather, there's an alliance that has formed between the Jagger and the Kachane Chamele, who are controlling the Seer. There were clues in those last few chapters that I've just read where I think it's something to do with the Jagged children who were thrown into the Rent right at the start of this book. The crippled god is still orchestrating everything, and it's him that's behind it all, but I've not quite managed to bring the threads together yet. We do also know that the crippled god is trying to get into the deck of dragons and become a player in this game. Oh, that was a really interesting reveal actually. I loved the imagery around Cruel, who is the Warrens. Like, it was described that when people walk through warrens. They're essentially walking through his blood vessels and his flesh. The crippled god seems to be poisoning these warrens, and now mages are struggling to access them. So that is very interesting. I love the warrens and the magic of this world. I think it is so intricate and fascinating, and usually I'm someone who prefers a hard magic system. However, I quite like that there's a lot of mystery to do with the magic of this world. I think it makes sense with the way that Steven Erikson likes to build a world. I think it makes sense that we don't currently have all of the information, but I'm assuming more information is going to come to us as we progress through the series. I'm also really liking trying to pick out where events in this book are referring to the first book. So we already have the caravan. I can't remember the name of the caravan company. It was all arranged by Krupe or Krupp. I can't ever remember how to say his name right. I'm still not the biggest fan of him, which I'll come on to maybe in a little bit later, but there's a caravan organisation that he has arranged to help with this fight against the Panion. And we met them in the second book, and so we know that the events of both books are happening side by side. I've worked out the reason why I'm not the biggest fan of Krupe. I mentioned in my Gardens of the Moon video that I find him really annoying, and I think it's because that type of humour just doesn't work for me. It reminds me of when I was in school and I would be stuck in lessons with people who saw themselves as class clowns and they wouldn't be taking the lesson seriously, and it used to really irritate me even though everyone else thought they were hilarious. You could maybe apply that to books like this where the topics and the themes are very deep and dark, and yet you've got this comic relief, which, don't get me wrong, I appreciate and understand that some people like that. I think just some of the humour just doesn't really work for me personally, and that's why I find Krupe really annoying. Speaking of dark topics, there's been some grim stuff in this latest part, specifically to do with the Teniscowry army. I have quite a strong stomach, but there's been some stuff in this that's really dark. I do appreciate how Steven Erikson doesn't seem to be writing stuff in a way that feels gratuitous. It feels almost clinical, the way that stuff is being described. Maybe clinical is the wrong word, but it feels very direct and to the point. It's not over describing stuff, it's just telling us the information and allowing us as the reader to react accordingly, and that's how I prefer darker topics to be handled. My favourite character at the moment is Quick Ben, and I need more of Quick Ben. I really enjoyed getting his backstory and that whole flashback that we got to Seven Cities, how they were pursuing Quick Ben across the desert, and we saw how he acquired all of these various souls, and then he voluntarily chose to join the Bridge Burners, even though they weren't even necessarily called that at the time. I think that's where they got the name from, was that pursuit across the desert, and I really liked that whole scene. I think up until this point, I've really struggled to connect with the Bridge Burners. In the first book, I felt like I was almost on the outside looking in, and I was seeing this group of characters interact, and it was very clear that these people have been together for a while and they have this camaraderie. So objectively, I could see what the author was doing, but I just wasn't really feeling that. However, with some of the scenes in this book so far, I am starting to feel that a lot more, which is great. Someone left a comment on one of my other videos where they were talking about how they started thinking of characters as being representatives of their different races or groups of people, and I think having that in my mind has really helped, especially when it comes to like the Bridge Burners, for example, and the Talani Mass in particular. Like Tool as a character, I feel doesn't have much personality, but knowing what the Talani Mass have been through and just thinking of them as like a group of people and how that might influence his motivations and his actions, I think that has really helped me now start to feel more invested. I love all of the different races of people, how we're getting more information about them and how we're getting more information in particular about the Barghast. I think the next chapter is called Capustan, so I'm expecting in that chapter we're gonna see more of the siege, but also in this section we've learned quite a lot about this city, how it relates to the Barghast and how they have been petitioning for years to be able to run pilgrimages to this place and they've always been turned down. It's really interesting understanding the Barghast culture and how that has been influenced by just what's happened in the past. The Barghast, the Toblerkai and the Imas all seem to be connected, and they've possibly originated from one elder race at some point. I think that's everything that I wanted to say in this update. If I've forgotten anything, then I'll mention it when I next check in with you. But so far, I didn't enjoy this last section as much as the first section. However, I am still enjoying this book as a whole, and I am interested to see how everything comes together. I'm really interested to see actually this siege of Capustan. I'm expecting we're going to get some more politicking and military strategy, and I really enjoy all of that sort of stuff. I have reached the end of part 3 in Memories of Ice, and we have a lot to talk about because there was a lot that happened in this last section. First of all, was not expecting how dark this was going to get, and I should have expected it because there's already been some very dark content throughout this book, and there were some dark moments in Dead House Gates, so I don't know why it took me by surprise. But yeah, there's some imagery that I'm never going to be able to get out of my brain, like when Gruntle is on top of that building that is so bloated it's weeping. That was disgusting. Don't get me wrong, I do appreciate how Stephen Erikson doesn't show away from showing the horror of war. I'm not a huge action driven reader, but I do appreciate the balance between the quieter moments and the behind the scenes mixed with following these soldiers who are on the front lines. I think that balance has been done well. So I didn't struggle as much as I have done in other books, and I do think that the battle scenes in this feel cinematic and it makes you feel like you're there, which, I mean, in some cases is not a good thing. Gruntle has become a more interesting character now though. I wasn't expecting, like I was a little bit confused when it was revealed that he's now the mortal sword of Trake. It took me a while to get my head around it, but then I realised on the front cover of this edition we literally have a picture of Gruntle and he's covered in tiger stripes. So how did I not see that come in? I think just some of the stuff surrounding Trake and Fenner and the gods, it is quite complex and it has taken me a while to get my head around everything, but I think I've managed to grasp it now. So I'm gonna just quickly talk through what I think has happened with Fenner because it links into some stuff from Dead House Gates. So from what I gather, when Heberic touched the green hand thing in the desert in Dead House Gates, he came into contact with chaos, which we know is what the crippled god is using. So whenever chaos is mentioned, I instantly think, okay, the crippled god is going to be involved somehow. Then when Ictovian chopped off the hands of Wrath Fenner, who was the priest that betrayed them, those hands I think were grabbed by the crippled god and given to Heberic, and that's why he now has these ghost hands. It was also described that both Wrath Fenner and Heberic, I think as well, they were both described as being covered in these alien tattoos. So I think that makes sense. The only thing I don't quite understand is why Fenner was pulled down to earth when Heberic touched this alien hand thing, which could that be part of the crippled god? Because when he was first brought to this world, it was said that he was ripped to pieces, so could it be that that was part of him? I don't know, I'm just speculating. But I think that Heberic in some way has unexpectedly and unwillingly become a pawn of the crippled god. Ictovian has also become a more interesting character. However, I will say there's been parts throughout this section where I haven't quite understood characters' motivations in the moment. That explanation has come afterwards, and it's not my favourite way of empathising with a character. Maybe empathising is the wrong word, but I feel like there's still that distance for me, and I think a lot of it comes down to characters do stuff and I don't understand their actions in the moment. Even when it's later explained, I can't retrospectively go back and change my mind about how I felt in that moment. Ictovian is a great example because there's this part where he comes across Anasta, I think might be his name, and he is with a group of Teniscauri, and Ictovian shows empathy for him in that moment, saying, I can take on your pain, or something like that. Initially, I felt like that came out of nowhere, even though we later get this explanation that that is Ictovian's role as the shield anvil, like his role is to take on the pain of war. If I were to go back and reread it, I might view that scene differently, but there's been a few examples, which I think I've got another one that I'm going to mention later on. Yeah, it just makes me not feel as emotionally attached. I hope what I'm saying makes sense, because I do think that some of the character work in this is fantastic, and there are certain characters where I can tell you about these characters. They feel like fully formed and well-developed characters. It's just the way that they're being built up. I feel like it is creating this distance. Ictovian has also started thinking about what's next for the Grey Swords now that Fenner has descended, if that's the right word, and he comes to the conclusion that they need to almost affiliate themselves with a different god, and they need fanatics to essentially make what they're doing worthwhile, because otherwise they're just mercenaries without purpose. So he heads out to the Barghast camp outside of Capustan, where there's a group of Rivi women who are waiting, and they start talking about these wolf gods called Togtha and Farrand, who were a mated pair. I'm assuming that Tog is the wolf that we saw in the beginning, who I think has now somehow become affiliated with Tok the Younger, because Tok keeps having these visions of wolves and so does the Rivi woman, the Maibi, who birthed Silver Fox. It said that the mortal sword has already been found, so I think that's Tok. Something is going on there. The Maibi is convinced that Silver Fox is trying to kill her using these wolves, but I don't think that's what's happening. Speaking of Silver Fox, she has refused to release the Talan Imas. They had this second gathering, and we don't know why. Again, I don't understand why Silver Fox made that decision, and there's theories that I can come up with, which I'm assuming is what I'm meant to do. I think I'm meant to think, okay, so why would Silver Fox make that decision? Is it coming from Tattersail? Is it coming from Night Chills? I mean, I think it's actually even said that all of them within Silver Fox, all of these different beings, they're all in agreement. Yeah, it's difficult to explain, because I think that it is a really clever way and a different way of building out characters, but it's not making me feel that emotionally invested in them. I know that what I'm saying is quite critical, but I am still enjoying this book, and I think there were some beautiful lines to do with the Talan Imas and how they were essentially begging to be released. Like, I can really empathise with that group of people. I don't even mind Krupe or Krupper. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but I'm not even minding him as much now, because I think that he has had some more serious moments. He's still not my favourite character, but he is clearly an important figure within the wider picture. We're at this point now where everyone seems to be travelling south in order to deal with this Panion threat. However, it's been very heavily, not even hinted, it's been stated that this is all a distraction. The Panion threat is not the main threat. So that makes me think, what else is going on that we don't know about? And Amanda Rake is also up to something. It's been mentioned that he has hidden Moonspawn somewhere, but we don't know what they're planning. There's also this big theme around free will versus determinism, and how Perrin doesn't believe that everything is predetermined and that the gods don't have as much influence as they might think. There are too many things that have happened that the gods wouldn't have been able to control and that they wouldn't have been able to predict was going to happen. So there's got to be an element of them taking advantage of stuff rather than predetermining everything. Perrin has been confronted with this decision where he has to decide whether to let the crippled god into the deck of dragons, and loads of people are telling him it's a terrible idea, don't do it. But he's thinking, hang on a minute, at the moment he is not bound by any rules, and if we let him into the deck, then he becomes a player in the game and we have more control. I actually think that line of thinking makes sense, and I am very curious to see the consequences of that decision, because again, I think this book has spoken a lot about consequences of decisions, how things that happened years and years ago, like I think at the start of the book we were 3 million years in the past, I might have made that up, but we were way far in the past, and we're seeing even today the repercussions of the actions that were made by characters back then. The crippled god has already recruited many people into this House of Chains, including Keller, but Calla has agreed only if he's given the opportunity to, I guess, harm Silver Fox, because we know he doesn't want her to stay around. So I'm interested to see if something happens with that in this next part. I have been talking for quite a while, so I'm going to wrap things up here, and I will check in with you once I've finished Memories of Ice. I am nervous that things are going to get emotional. It is time for me to bring you my final thoughts on Memories of Ice, because I finished this last night, and this is my favourite Malazan book that I've read so far. I'm giving it a 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave Dead House Gates. If we're being really specific though, Dead House Gates was a solid 8 out of 10, whereas this was more like an 8.5. So we're on an upward trajectory in terms of my ratings for the books in this series. I'm still confident that at some point I will give a book 5 stars. There's potential there. I think it's mostly the characters that I'm struggling with. It's really interesting actually reading this with my partner, because we're both highlighting as we go, and then we catch up at the end of each chapter and compare notes. The stuff that we highlight that's the same is always to do with world building or plot or reveals. I very quickly noticed that he was also highlighting stuff to do with characters and interactions, things that he found funny or emotional or poignant. I think seeing his notes and seeing the stuff that he really loves about this series, he loves Stephen Erickson's dialogue. It's not that I'm not able to recognise those moments. In fact, I'm really glad that I'm reading this with him, because I think seeing what he loves has helped me see what so many fans of this series really connect with. I think it's just that we're different readers, and I think the main thing for me is I need to spend more time with characters to really connect with them. And I think that Stephen Erickson does a great job of building unique characters within a short space of time. But there's been parts where I've just not really found stuff believable. Like, it's just not really clicked in my brain. Things like when Tool is approaching the city of Coral and he's thinking to himself how much of a friend Tok the Younger is to him. In my brain, I'm thinking, okay, well, the scenes between them, yeah, there were some really great written conversations between them, but I'm not really believing that they're friends, because I don't feel like they spent enough time together for me to really believe in that. Like, I can roll with it and it's not gonna affect my overall enjoyment of what's happening. It just means that I'm not connecting on an emotional level. I did notice that I liked the bridge burners a lot more in this book in comparison to Gardens of the Moon, maybe because the groundwork had already been laid in book 1. So with this book, I didn't feel like I was starting afresh. What I love about this series is the world and how it feels old. There's so much history there. It feels really lived in. And I loved how throughout Memories of Ice, and even in previous books, we get hints at stuff that's happening on other continents that we haven't even been to yet, and so it feels very immersive. I want to go to these other continents. I want to know what's going on over there, and that is the main thing that's motivating me to continue with the series. I am going to be picking up book 4. I am fully prepared if at any point I'm not enjoying the series anymore, then I will DNF. When things come together and when things click in my brain, I love that feeling. There were so many satisfying moments towards the end of Memories of Ice. Let's actually talk about some of the main things that happened in this final quarter, because I realised I haven't done that yet. So first of all, we had Whiskey Jack's death, which I felt was very heavily foreshadowed. That wasn't a surprise to me. It didn't mean that it wasn't sad, but I felt like even things like it kept mentioning that his leg hadn't healed properly. I didn't know how he was going to die, but as soon as he started talking about wanting to retire, I thought, oh no, you are not going to make it to the end of this campaign. I know what's coming. Telling that scene from Quorlat's perspective, I also thought added an extra layer of emotion in that scene. All of the follow-on from that as well, like the grief that all of the bridge burners felt. There was actually a scene afterwards where the healer, Mallet, I think is his name, where he's thinking, you can tell, it doesn't even tell you that this is what he's thinking, but you can just tell in the way that the scene is framed that he's looking at Whiskey Jack and he's thinking, if only I had pushed him more to get that leg healed, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. And I felt like that was just an extra layer to this entire situation of what had happened. One thing that I didn't see come in was the reveal around Taishran and how he has been with them this whole time. I did think that that came out of nowhere. However, speaking to my partner, because he knew that that was coming, he was able to look out for the very subtle foreshadowing that apparently was there. There was a scene earlier in the book where Dujek and Whiskey Jack are talking about Pale and how it wasn't necessarily a betrayal, it was a mistake, and that Taishran thought that keeping them in the mines was actually the safest place for the bridge burners, and it was all a misunderstanding. During that scene, they were talking about whether Taishran had apologised yet, and thinking back, like, it was such a small thing, but obviously why would they say that if they didn't know that Taishran was there, like he was close to them, he wasn't off on a different continent. Everything that happened with the Mybi and Silver Fox building this dream world, I believe is essentially the Hold of the Beasts, the original hold, house, whatever you want to call it, of the Imass. There was some really cool imagery there, and I liked how that all came together. I do think there's an element with the magic of just having to roll with stuff and just accept that this is happening and this is possible. My brain keeps trying to push against it because I do prefer a hard magic system, but the imagery I thought was really cool. When I realised what was happening with Ictovian, how he was approaching the city of Coral and how he could feel the grief, and as the reader I was assuming that he was feeling the grief of this war. Actually what he was feeling was the grief of the Talan Imass. As soon as I got to that moment and it clicked what was going to happen, or what I thought was going to happen, how he was going to take on the grief of the Talan Imass, there's this moment where they all turn to look at him and Silver Fox is reacting saying no, 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 no. Like, that moment I thought was really well done. Silver Fox did annoy me a little bit because so much of that could have been prevented if she had just told people what her plan was. Why the secrecy? A couple of other things that I wrote down was Tok and Anasta, and how Tok has now been placed into Anasta's body. I called that ages ago. I don't think I said it actually in this vlog. I didn't know what was going to happen there, but I turned to my partner at one point and I said, what is with all of these people who only have one eye? And Asta lost his eye at one point, and I said, there's got to be a reason for that. Is it going to be connected with the one-eyed wolf and with Tok the Younger? Like, what's going on there? So that was a really good moment. Also, when Baldin showed up and he is now the Knight of Death, didn't see that coming, but I'm glad that Baldin is back because he was one of my favourite characters from Dead House Gates. I do like how resurrection has been incorporated in this series. Usually I'm not a fan of the resurrection trope, however I'm only not a fan of it when it feels convenient, and it doesn't feel convenient in Malazan. It feels like it's just part of the magic. When you look at Silver Fox's character, Silver Fox is not Tattersail. She is a combination of, well, 4 different people. So I think it's really interesting exploring resurrection in that way. I completely forgot to mention one of my favourite scenes is when Moonspawn comes up out of the sea and it's revealed that that's where it's been hiding this whole time. But now the Tistandi have lost their home because it's so full of water, they decide to just send it out into the sea with all of the fallen from this battle. I thought that was done really well visually. I could picture it so clearly. I mean, it might help that I have some artwork. Where is it? Up here. This is by Mark Simonetti. I think I showed this actually in one of my other videos, but I can very clearly picture what Moonspawn looks like. It was so cool actually as well, getting some of the backstory of Moonspawn, how it was a creation by the Kachane Chamele, I think, or it might have been the version of the Kachane Chamele who came before. You know what I mean if you've read the book. But yeah, that was a really cool moment and I wanted to mention it. I love a full circle moment, and I feel like we got that in this book with Perrin and Quick Ben and the Jaggert children, how we're back in the same place that we were in the beginning where it all began. I loved that. I loved how it all tied together. It was really satisfying, and yeah, I am gonna end things here because I am running out of space on my memory card. So let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts or feelings on this book. Hopefully I will be picking up book 4 at some point in May, but my review probably won't be going live until June because it takes me a long time to read these books. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye.